John Calvin. 1. Youth. He was born at Noyon, France, July 10, 1509. It was an ecclesiastical city, dominated by its cathedral and its bishop. Here at the outset he had an example of theocracy, the rule of a society by clergymen in the name of God. His father, Gérard Chauvin, was secretary to the bishop, proctor in the cathedral chapter, and fiscal procurator of the county. Jean's mother died while he was still young. The father married again, and perhaps Calvin owed to stern step-rearing part of his somber spirit. Gérard destined 3 of his sons for the priesthood, confident that he could place them well. He found benefices for 2, but one of these became a heretic and died refusing the sacraments. Gérard himself was excommunicated after a financial dispute with the cathedral chapter, and had some trouble getting buried in holy ground. Jean was sent to the Collège de la Marche at the University of Paris. He registered as Johannes Calvinus and learned to write excellent Latin. He passed later to the Collège du Montaigu, where he must have heard echoes of its famous pupil Erasmus. He remained there till 1528, when his Catholic counterpart, Ignatius Loyola, entered. The stories told at one time of Calvin's ill-regulated youth, says a Catholic authority, have no foundation. On the contrary, the available evidence indicates an assiduous student, shy, taciturn, pious, and already a severe censor of his comrades' morals, yet loved by his friends, now as later, with an unshakable fidelity. In the hot pursuit of esoteric knowledge or fascinating theory, he read far into the night. Even in those student years he developed some of the many ailments that plagued his mature life and helped to form his mood. Unexpectedly, late in 1528, a directive came from his father to go to Orléans and study law, presumably, said the son, because he judged that the science of laws commonly enriched those who followed it. Calvin took readily enough to the new study. Law, not philosophy or literature, seemed to him the outstanding intellectual achievement of mankind, the molding of man's anarchic impulses to order and peace. He left Paris in January 1534. There, probably in the rich library of Louis de Tillet, he began to write his Institutes. In May, he ventured back to Noyon and surrendered the benefices whose income had been supporting him. He was arrested there, was freed, was rearrested, and again freed. He returned clandestinely to Paris, talked with Protestant leaders, and met Servetus, whom he was to burn. When some Protestant extremists posted abusive placards at various points in Paris, Francis I retaliated with a furious persecution. Calvin fled just in time in December 1534 and joined Cope in Basel. There, a lad of 26, he completed the most eloquent, fervent, lucid, logical, influential, and terrible work in all the literature of the religious revolution. 2. The Theologian. He published the book in Latin in 1536 as Christianae Religionis Institutio, the Principles of the Christian Religion. Within a year the issue was sold out and a new edition was invited. Calvin responded with a much enlarged version in 1539, again in Latin. In 1541 he translated this into French, and this form of the work is one of the most impressive productions in the gamut of French prose. The Parlement of Paris proscribed the book in both languages, and copies of it were publicly burned in the capital. Calvin continued throughout his life to expand and republish it. In its final form, it ran to 1,118 pages. The first edition opened with a passionate but dignified preface to the most Christian king of France. 2 events gave occasion for addressing Francis: the royal edict of January 1535 against the French Protestants, and the almost simultaneous invitation of Francis to Melanchthon and Butzer to come to France and arrange an alliance between the French monarch and the Lutheran princes against Charles V. Calvin hoped to reinforce political expediency with theological arguments, and helped incline the king, like his sister, toward the Protestant cause. He was anxious to dissociate this from the Anabaptist movement then verging on communism in Münster. He described the French reformers as patriots, devoted to the king and diverse from all economic or political disturbance. The beginning and end of this famous preface reveal the majesty of Calvin's thought and style. When I began this work, sire, nothing was further from my thoughts than writing a book which would afterwards be presented to your majesty. My intention was only to lay down some elementary principles, by which inquirers on the subject of religion might be instructed in the nature of true piety. But when I perceived that the fury of certain wicked men in your kingdom had grown to such a height as to leave no room in the land for sound doctrine, I thought I should be usefully employed if in the same work I exhibited my confession to you, that you may know the nature of that doctrine which is the object of such unbounded rage in those madmen who are now disturbing the country with fire and sword. For I shall not be afraid to acknowledge that this treatise contains a summary of that very doctrine, which, according to their clamors, deserves to be punished with imprisonment, banishment, proscription, and flames, and to be exterminated from the face of the earth. I well know with what atrocious insinuations your ears have been filled by them in order to render our cause most odious in your esteem, but your clemency should lead you to consider that if accusation be accounted sufficient evidence of guilt, there will be an end to all innocence in words and actions. You yourself, sire, can bear witness of the false calumnies with which you hear it, our cause, daily traduced, that its only tendency is to wrest the scepters of kings out of their hands, to overturn all the tribunals, to subvert all order and government, to disturb the peace and tranquillity of the people, to abrogate all laws, to scatter all properties and possessions, and, in a word, to involve everything in total confusion. Wherefore, I beseech you, sire, and surely it is not an unreasonable request, to take upon yourself the entire cognizance of this cause, which has hitherto been confusedly and carelessly agitated, without any order of law and with outrageous passion rather than judicial gravity. Think not that I am now meditating my own individual defense in order to effect a safe return to my native country. For though I feel the affection which every man ought to feel for it, yet under the existing circumstances I regret not my removal from it. But I plead the cause of all the godly, and consequently of Christ himself. Is it probable that we are meditating the subversion of kingdoms, we who were never heard to utter a factious word, whose lives were ever known to be peaceable and honest while we lived under your government, and who, even now in our exile, cease not to pray for all prosperity to attend yourself and your kingdom? Nor have we, by divine grace, profited so little in the gospel, but that our life may be an example to our detractors of chastity, liberality, mercy, temperance, patience, modesty, and every other virtue. Though you are now averse and alienated from us, and even inflamed against us, we despair not of regaining your favor, if you will only read with calmness and composure this our confession, which we intend as our defense before your majesty. But on the contrary, if your ears are so preoccupied with the whispers of the malevolent as to leave no opportunity for the accused to speak for themselves, and if those outrageous furies, with your connivance, continue to persecute with imprisonments, scourges, tortures, confiscations, and flames, we shall indeed, like sheep destined for the slaughter, be reduced to the greatest extremities. Yet shall we in patience possess our souls, and wait for the mighty hand of the Lord, for the deliverance of the poor from their affliction, and for the punishment of their despisers, who now exult in such perfect security. May the Lord, the King of kings, establish your throne with righteousness, and your kingdom with equity. It is difficult for us, in an age when theology has given place to politics as the center of human interest and conflict, to recapture the mood in which Calvin composed the Institutes. He, much more than Spinoza, was a God-intoxicated man. He was overwhelmed by a sense of man's littleness and God's immensity. How absurd it would be to suppose that the frail reason of so infinitesimal a might as man could understand the mind behind these innumerable obedient stars. In pity of man's reason, God has revealed himself to us in the Bible. That this holy book is his word, says Calvin, is proved by the unrivaled impression that it makes on the human spirit. Read Demosthenes or Cicero, read Plato, Aristotle, or any others of that class. I grant you that you will be attracted, delighted, moved, and enraptured by them in a surprising manner. But if, after reading them, you turn to the perusal of the sacred volume, whether you are willing or unwilling, it will affect you so powerfully, it will so penetrate your heart, and impress itself so strongly on your mind, that, compared with its energetic influence, the beauties of rhetoricians and philosophers will almost entirely disappear, so that it is easy to perceive something divine in the sacred scriptures, which far surpasses the highest attainments and ornaments of human industry. Consequently, this revealed word must be our final authority, not only in religion and morals, but in history, politics, and everything. We must accept the story of Adam and Eve, for by their disobedience to God we explain man's evil nature and his loss of free will. The mind of man is so completely alienated from the righteousness of God that it conceives, desires, and undertakes everything that is impious, perverse, base, impure, and flagitious. His heart is so thoroughly infected by the poison of sin that it cannot produce anything but what is corrupt. And if at any time men do anything apparently good, yet the mind always remains involved in hypocrisy and deceit, and the heart enslaved by its inward perversity. How could so depraved a being ever deserve eternal happiness in paradise? Not one of us could ever earn it by any amount of good works. Good works are good, but only the sacrificial death of the Son of God could avail to earn salvation for men. Not for all men, for God's justice demands the damnation of most men. But his mercy has chosen some of us to be saved, and to these he has given an upholding faith in their redemption by Christ. For St. Paul said, God the Father hath chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love, having predestinated us unto the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will. Calvin, like Luther, interpreted this to mean that God, by a free choice quite independent of our virtues and vices, determined long before the creation just who is to be saved and who is to be damned. To the question why God should choose men for salvation or damnation without regard to their merits, Calvin answers again in the words of Paul. For he saith to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. Calvin concludes, in conformity, therefore, to the clear doctrine of Scripture, we assert that by an eternal and immutable counsel, God has once for all determined both whom he would admit to salvation and whom he would condemn to destruction. We affirm that this counsel, as far as concerns the elect, is founded on his gratuitous mercy, totally irrespective of human merit, but that to those whom he devotes to condemnation, the gate of life is closed by a just and irreprehensible, but incomprehensible, judgment. Even the fall of Adam and Eve, with all its consequences, in the Pauline theory, to the human race, was ordained by the admirable counsel of God. Calvin admits that predestination is repulsive to reason, but he replies, it is unreasonable that man should scrutinize with impunity those things which the Lord has determined to be hidden in himself. Yet he professes to know why God so arbitrarily determines the eternal fate of billions of souls. It is to promote our admiration of his glory by the display of his power. He argues that this is a horrible decree, decretum horribile, but no one can deny that God foreknew the future final fate of man before he created him, and that he foreknew it because it was appointed by his own decree. Others might argue, like Luther, that the future is determined because God has foreseen it, and his foresight cannot be falsified. Calvin reverses the matter and considers that God foresees the future because he has willed and determined it. And the decree of damnation is absolute. There is no purgatory in Calvin's theology, no halfway house where one might, by a few million years of burning, wipe out his reprobation. And therefore, there is no room for prayers for the dead. We might suppose that on Calvin's assumptions there would be no sense in any kind of prayer. All being fixed by divine decree, not an ocean of orisons could wash away one jot of the inexorable destiny. However, Calvin is more human than his theology. Let us pray with humility and faith, he tells us, and our prayers will be answered. The prayer and the answer were also decreed. Let us worship God in humble religious services, but we must reject the Mass as a sacrilegious pretense of priests to transform earthly materials into the body and blood of Christ. Christ is present in the Eucharist only spiritually, not physically, and the adoration of the consecrated wafer as literally Christ is sheer idolatry. The use of graven images of the deity, in clear violation of the second commandment, encourages idolatry. All religious pictures and statuary, even the crucifix, should be removed from the churches. The true church is the invisible congregation of the elect, dead, living, or to be born. The visible church is composed of all those who, by a confession of faith and exemplary life, and participation in the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper, Calvin rejects the other sacraments, profess the same God and Christ with ourselves. Outside of this church there is no salvation. Church and state are both divine and are designed by God to work in harmony as the soul and body of one Christian society. The church should regulate all details of faith, worship, and morals. The state, as the physical arm of the church, should enforce these regulations. The secular authorities must also see to it that idolatry, largely synonymous with Catholicism in Protestant usage, and other scandals to religion be not publicly set forth and broadcast among the people, and that only the pure word of God should be taught and received. The ideal government will be a theocracy, and the Reformed Church should be recognized as the voice of God. All the claims of the popes for the supremacy of the Church over the state were renewed by Calvin for his Church. It is remarkable how much of Roman Catholic tradition and theory survived in Calvin's theology. He owed something to Stoicism, especially to Seneca, and something to his studies of law. But his chief reliance was on St. Augustine, who drew predestinarianism out of St. Paul, who did not know Christ. Calvin sternly ignored Christ's conception of God as a loving and merciful Father, and calmly passed by a multitude of biblical passages that assumed man's freedom to mold his own destiny. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 4, 1 John chapter 2, verse 2, chapter 4, verse 14, etc. Calvin's genius lay not in conceiving new ideas, but in developing the thought of his predecessors to ruinously logical conclusions, expressing these with an eloquence equaled only by Augustine, and formulating their practical implications in a system of ecclesiastical legislation. He took from Luther the doctrine of justification, or election by faith, from Zwingli the spiritual interpretation of the Eucharist, and from Butzer the contradictory notions of the divine will as the cause of all events, and the requirement of a strenuous practical piety as the test and witness of election. Most of these Protestant doctrines had come down, in milder form, in Catholic tradition. Calvin gave them stark emphasis, and neglected the compensatory mitigating elements in the medieval faith. He was more medieval than any thinker between Augustine and Dante. He completely rejected the humanist concern with earthly excellence, and turned men's thoughts again, more somberly than before, to the afterworld. In Calvinism, the Reformation again repudiated the Renaissance. That so unprepossessing a theology should have won the assent of hundreds of millions of men in Switzerland, France, Scotland, England, and North America is at first sight a mystery, then an illumination. Why should Calvinists, Huguenots, and Puritans have fought so valiantly in defense of their own helplessness? And why has this theory of human impotence shared in producing some of the strongest characters in history? Is it because these believers gained more strength from believing themselves the few elect than they lost by admitting that their conduct contributed nothing to their fate? Calvin himself, at once shy and resolute, was confident that he belonged to the elect, and this so comforted him that he found the horrible decree of predestination productive of the most delightful benefit. Did some of the self-elect take pleasure in considering how few were to be saved, and how many were to be damned? The belief that they were chosen of God gave many souls the courage to face the vicissitudes and apparent aimlessness of life, as a similar faith enabled the Jewish people to preserve itself amid difficulties that might otherwise have sapped the will to live. Indeed, the Calvinist idea of being divinely chosen may have been indebted to the Jewish form of the belief, as Protestantism in general owed so much to the Old Testament. The confidence in divine election must have been a tower of courage to Huguenots suffering war and massacre, and to pilgrims uprooting themselves perilously to seek new homes on hostile shores. If a reformed sinner could catch this confidence, and could believe that his reform had been ordained by God, he could stand unshaken to the end. Calvin enhanced this feeling of pride in election by making the elect, penniless or not, an hereditary aristocracy. The children of the elect were automatically elect by the will of God. So, by a simple act of faith in oneself, one could, if only in imagination, possess and transmit paradise. For such immortal boons, a confession of helplessness was a bargain price. Calvin's followers needed such consolation, for he taught them the medieval view that earthly life is a vale of misery and tears. He cheerfully granted the correctness of their opinion who considered it as the greatest boon not to be born, and as the next greatest to die immediately. Nor was there anything irrational in the conduct of those who mourned and wept at the birth of their relations, and solemnly rejoiced at their funerals. He merely regretted that these wise pessimists, being mostly pagans ignorant of Christ, were doomed to everlasting hell. Only one thing could make life bearable, the hope of uninterrupted happiness after death. If heaven is our country, what is the earth but a place of exile? And if the departure out of this world is an entrance into life, what is the world but a sepulchre? Unlike his poetical counterpart, Calvin gives his most eloquent pages not to the phantasmagoria of hell, but to the loveliness of heaven. the pious elect will suffer without a murmur all the pains and griefs of life. For they will keep in view that day when the Lord will receive his faithful servants into his peaceful kingdom, will wipe every tear from their eyes, invest them with robes of joy, adorn them with crowns of glory, entertain them with ineffable delights, and exalt them to a fellowship with his majesty and a participation in his happiness. For the poor or unfortunate who cover the earth, it may have been an indispensable belief. 3. Geneva and Strasbourg, 1536 to 1541. While the Institutes was in the press in March of 1536, Calvin, according to a tradition generally but not unanimously accepted, made a hurried trip across the Alps to Ferrara, probably to ask help for the persecuted Protestants of France from the Protestant Duchess Renée, wife of Duke Ercole II and daughter of the late Louis XII. Moved by the fervor of his religious convictions, she made him her spiritual guide through reverent correspondence till his death. Returning to Basel in May, Calvin ventured to Noyon to sell some property. Then, with a brother and a sister, he started for Strasbourg. War barring the road, they stopped for a time at Geneva in July of 1536. The capital of French Switzerland was older than history. In prehistoric times, it was a congeries of lake dwellings built upon piles, some of which can still be seen. In Caesar's day, it was a busy crossing of trade routes at the bridge where the Rhone rushes out of Lake Leman to wander through France in search of the Mediterranean. In the Middle Ages, Geneva fell under the secular as well as spiritual rule of its bishop. Normally, the bishop was chosen by the cathedral chapter, which thereby became a power in the city. This was essentially the government that Calvin later restored in Protestant form. In the 15th century, the Dukes of Savoy, which lay just beyond the Alps, secured control of the chapter and raised to the episcopate men subservient to Savoy and given to the pleasures of this world for fear there might not be a next. The once excellent episcopal government and the morals of the clergy under it deteriorated. A priest, bidden to dismiss his concubine, agreed to do so as soon as his fellow clergymen would be equally ungallant. Gallantry prevailed. Within this ecclesiastical ducal rule, the leading families of Geneva organized a council of 60 for municipal ordinances, and the council chose 4 syndics as executive officers. Usually, the council met in the bishop's cathedral of St. Peter, and religious and civil jurisdiction were so mingled that while the bishop minted the coinage and led the army, the council regulated morals, issued excommunications, and licensed prostitutes. As in Trier, Mainz, and Cologne, the bishop was also a prince of the Holy Roman Empire, and naturally assumed functions from which bishops are now free. Some civic leaders, led by François de Bonivard, sought to liberate the city from both the episcopal and the ducal authority. To strengthen this movement, these patriotes effected an alliance with Catholic Fribourg and Protestant Bern. Adherents of the alliance were called by the German term for confederates, Eidgenossen, oath comrades. The French corrupted this into Huguenots, or Huguenots. By 1520, the Genevese leaders were mostly businessmen, for Geneva, unlike Wittenberg, was a commercial city, mediating in trade between Switzerland on the north, Italy on the south, and France on the west. The Genevese burghers set up in 1526 a great council of 200, and this chose a small council of 25, which became the real ruler of the municipality, frequently flouting the authority of bishop and duke alike. The bishop declared the city in rebellion and summoned ducal troops to his aid. These seized Bonivard and imprisoned him in the castle of Chillon. The Bernese army came to the aid of beleaguered Geneva. The duke's forces were defeated and dispersed. The bishop fled to Annecy. Byron's hero was freed from his dungeon. The Great Council, angered by the clergy's support of Savoy, declared for the Reformed faith and assumed ecclesiastical as well as civil jurisdiction throughout the city in 1536. 2 months before Calvin arrived. The doctrinal hero of this revolution was William Farel. Like Luther, he was passionately pious in his youth. At Paris, he came under the influence of Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples, whose translation and explanation of the Bible upset Farel's orthodoxy. For in the Scriptures he could find no trace of popes, bishops, indulgences, purgatory, 7 sacraments, the Mass, the celibacy of the clergy, the worship of Mary or the saints. Disdaining ordination, he set out as an independent preacher, wandering from town to town in France and Switzerland. Small of stature, weak of frame, strong of voice and spirit, his pale face brightened by fiery eyes and a beard of flaming red, he denounced the Pope as Antichrist, the Mass as sacrilege, the church icons as idola that must be destroyed. In 1532 he began to preach in Geneva. He was arrested by the bishop's agents, who proposed to throw the Lutheran dog into the Rhone. The syndics intervened, and Farel escaped with a few bruises on his head and some spittle on his coat. He won the Council of 25 to his views, and, with the aid of Peter Verret and Antoine Froment, aroused so much popular support that nearly all the Catholic clergy departed. On May 21, 1536, the small council decreed the abolition of the Mass and the removal of all images and relics from the churches. Ecclesiastical properties were converted to Protestant uses for religion, charity, and education. Education was made compulsory and free of charge, and a strict moral discipline was made law. The citizens were called upon to swear allegiance to the gospel, and those who refused to attend Reformed services were banished. This was the Geneva to which Calvin came. Farel was now 47, and though he was destined to outlive Calvin by a year, he saw in the stern and eloquent youth, 20 years his junior, just the man needed to consolidate and advance the reform. Calvin was reluctant. He had planned a life of scholarship and writing. He was more at ease with God than with men. But Farel, with the mien of some thundering biblical prophet, threatened to lay a holy curse upon him if he should prefer his private studies to the arduous and dangerous preaching of the undiluted word. Calvin yielded, council and presbytery approved, and, with no other ordination, he began his ministry on September 5, 1536, by giving in the Church of St. Peter the first of several addresses on the epistles of St. Paul. Everywhere in Protestantism, except among the socially radical sects, the influence of Paul overshadowed that of Peter, the reputed founder of the Roman See. In October, Calvin accompanied Farel and Viret to Lausanne, and took a minor part in the famous disputation that won that city to the Protestant camp. Returning to Geneva, the senior and junior pastors of St. Peter's set about to rededicate the Genevese to God. Sincerely accepting the Bible as the literal word of God, they felt an inescapable obligation to enforce its moral code. They were shocked to find many of the people given to singing, dancing, and similar gaieties. Moreover, some gambled or drank to intoxication or committed adultery. An entire district of the city was occupied by prostitutes under the rule of their own Reine du Bordel, the brothel queen. To the fiery Farel and the conscientious Calvin, a genial acceptance of this situation was treason to God. To restore the religious basis of an effective morality, Farel issued a confession of faith and discipline, and Calvin a popular catechism, which the Great Council approved in November 1536. Citizens persistently transgressing the moral code were to be excommunicated and exiled. In July 1535, the council ordered all citizens to go to the Church of St. Peter and swear allegiance to Farel's confession. Any manifestation of Catholicism, such as carrying a rosary, cherishing a sacred relic, or observing a saint's day as holy, was subject to punishment. Women were imprisoned for wearing improper hats. Bonnivard, too joyous in his liberty, was warned to end his licentious ways. Gamblers were put into the stocks. Adulterers were driven through the streets into banishment. Accustomed to ecclesiastical rule, but to the lenient moral discipline of a Catholicism softened by southern climes, the Genevese resisted the new dispensation. The Patriotes, who had freed the city from bishop and duke, reorganized to free it from its zealous ministers. Another party, demanding liberty of conscience and worship, and therefore called libertins, or liberals, joined with the Patriotes and the secret Catholics, and this coalition, in the election of February 3, 1538, captured a majority in the Great Council. The new council told the ministers to keep out of politics. Farel and Calvin denounced the council and refused to serve the Lord's Supper until the rebellious city conformed to the sworn discipline. The council deposed the two ministers on April 23 and ordered them to leave the city within 3 days. The people celebrated the dismissal with public rejoicings. Farel accepted a call to Neuchâtel. There he preached to the end of his days, in 1565, and there a public monument honors his memory. Calvin went to Strasbourg, then a free city subject only to the emperor, and ministered to l'Église des Étrangers, a congregation of Protestants chiefly from France. To eke out the 52 guilders, or about $1,300 annually paid him by the church, he sold his library and took students as boarders. Finding bachelorhood inconvenient in this situation, he asked Farel and Butzer to search out a wife for him, and listed specifications. "I am none of those insane lovers who, when once smitten with the fine figure of a woman, embrace also her faults. This only is the beauty which allures me, that she be chaste, obliging, not fastidious, economical, patient, and careful for my health." After 2 false starts, he married, in 1540, Idelette de Bure, a poor widow with several children. She bore him 1 child who died in infancy. When she passed away in 1549, he wrote of her with the private tenderness that underlay his public severity. He lived in domestic loneliness the remaining 15 years of his life. While he labored in Strasbourg, events moved on at Geneva. Encouraged by the expulsion of Farel and Calvin, the exiled bishop planned a triumphant return to his cathedral. As a preliminary step, he persuaded Jacopo Sadoleto to write an epistle to the Genevese, urging them to resume their Catholic worship and faith, this in 1539. Sadoleto was a gentleman of exceptional virtue for a cardinal and a humanist. He had already advised the papacy to handle Protestant dissent gently, and he later received under his protection at Carpentras heretical Valdenses fleeing from massacre in 1545. In a fine Latin learned under the impeccable Bembo, he addressed to his dearly beloved brethren, the magistrates, senate, and citizens of Geneva, 20 pages of diplomatic courtesies and theological exhortation. He noted the rapid division of Protestantism into warring sects, led, he alleged, by crafty men avid for power. He compared this with the centuries-long unity of the Roman Church, and asked whether it was more likely the truth lay with those contradictory factions than with the Catholic doctrine formed by the experience of ages and the assembled intelligence of ecclesiastical councils. He concluded by offering to Geneva whatever service it was in his power to give. The council thanked him for his compliments and promised him a further response. But no one could be found in Geneva who would undertake to cross swords or Latin with a polished humanist. Meanwhile, a number of citizens asked to be released from their oath to support the confession of faith and discipline, and for a time it seemed that the city would return to Catholicism. Calvin learned of the situation, and in a reply to the cardinal he rose with all the power of his mind and pen to the defense of the Reformation. He countered courtesy with courtesy, eloquence with eloquence, but he would not yield an inch of his theology. He protested against the implication that he had rebelled through personal ambition. He could have risen to far greater comfort had he remained orthodox. He admitted the divine foundation of the Catholic Church, but he charged that the vices of the Renaissance popes proved the capture of the papacy by Antichrist. To the wisdom of church councils he opposed the wisdom of the Bible, which Sadoleto had almost ignored. He regretted that the corruption of the Church had necessitated secession and division, but only so could the evils be cured. If Catholics and Protestants would now cooperate to cleanse the doctrine, ritual, and personnel of all the Christian churches, they would be rewarded with a final unity in heaven with Christ. It was a powerful letter, perhaps unappreciative of the incidental virtues of the Renaissance popes, but otherwise phrased with a comity and dignity rare in the controversies of the time. Luther, reading it in Wittenberg, hailed it as quite annihilating the cardinal. "I rejoice," he cried, "that God raises up men who will finish the war against Antichrist which I began." The Council of Geneva was so impressed that it ordered the 2 letters printed at the city's expense in 1540. It began to wonder whether, in banishing Calvin, it had lost the ablest man in the Swiss reform. Other factors nourished the doubt. The ministers who had replaced Farel and Calvin proved incompetent both in preaching and in discipline. The public lost respect for them and returned to the easy morality of unreformed days. Gambling, drunkenness, street brawls, adultery flourished. Lewd songs were publicly sung, persons romped naked through the streets. Of the 4 syndics who had led the movement to expel Farel and Calvin, 1 had to be condemned to death for murder, another for forgery, a 3rd for treason, and the 4th died while trying to escape arrest. The businessmen who controlled the council must have frowned upon this disorder as impeding trade. The council itself had no taste for being replaced and perhaps excommunicated by a restored bishop. Gradually, a majority of the members came to the idea of recalling Calvin. On May 1, 1541, the council annulled the sentence of banishment and pronounced Farel and Calvin to be honorable men. Deputation after deputation was sent to Strasbourg to persuade Calvin to resume his pastorate at Geneva. Farel forgave the city for not extending him a similar invitation, and with noble generosity joined the deputations in urging Calvin to return. But Calvin had made many friends in Strasbourg, felt obligations there, and saw nothing but strife in store for him at Geneva. "There is no place in the world that I fear more." He agreed only to pay the city a visit. When he arrived, on September 13, 1541, he received so many honors, so many apologies, so many promises of cooperation in re-establishing order and the gospel, that he had not the heart to refuse. On September 16th he wrote to Farel, "Your wish is granted. I am held fast here. May God give his blessing." 4. The City of God. Calvin behaved, in the early years of his recall, with the moderation and modesty that won all but a small minority to his support. 8 assistant pastors were appointed under him to serve St. Peter's and the other churches of the city. He labored 12 to 18 hours a day as preacher, administrator, professor of theology, superintendent of churches and schools, advisor to municipal councils, and regulator of public morals and church liturgy. Meanwhile, he kept enlarging the institutes, wrote commentaries on the Bible, and maintained a correspondence second in extent only to that of Erasmus, and surpassing it in influence. He slept little, ate little, fasted frequently. His successor and biographer, Theodore de Beze, marveled that one little man, unicus homunculus, could carry so heavy and varied a burden. His first task was the reorganization of the Reformed Church. At his request, the small council, soon after his return, appointed a commission of 5 clergymen and 6 counselors, with Calvin at their head, to formulate a new ecclesiastical code. On January 2, 1542, the Great Council ratified the resultant Ordonnance ecclésiastique, whose essential features are still accepted by the Reformed and Presbyterian churches of Europe and America. The ministry was divided into pastors, teachers, lay elders, and deacons. The pastors of Geneva constituted the Venerable Company, which governed the church and trained candidates for the ministry. No one henceforth was to preach in Geneva without authorization by the company. The consent of the city council and the congregation was also required, but episcopal ordinations and bishops were taboo. The new clergy, while never claiming the miraculous powers of the Catholic priests, and though decreeing themselves ineligible for civil office, became under Calvin more powerful than any priesthood since ancient Israel. "The real law of a Christian state," said Calvin, "must be the Bible. The clergy are the proper interpreters of that law. Civil governments are subject to that law and must enforce it as so interpreted." The practical men in the councils may have had some doubts on these points, but they appear to have felt that social order was so profitable to the economy that some ecclesiastical assumptions might for the time being go unchallenged. Through an astonishing quarter of a century, a theocracy of clergymen seemed to dominate an oligarchy of merchants and men of affairs. The authority of the clergy over Genevese life was exercised through a consistory or presbytery composed of 5 pastors and 12 lay elders, all chosen by the council. As the pastors held tenure throughout their ministry, and the elders for only a year, the consistory, in matters not vitally affecting business, was ruled by its ecclesiastical members. It took the right to ordain the religious worship and moral conduct of every inhabitant. It sent a minister and an elder to visit every house and family annually. It could summon any person before it for examination. It could publicly reprove or excommunicate offenders, and could rely on the council to banish from the city those whom the consistory banned from the church. Calvin held power as the head of this consistory. From 1541 till his death in 1564, his voice was the most influential in Geneva. His dictatorship was one not of law or force, but of will and character. The intensity of his belief in his mission, and the completeness of his devotion to his tasks, gave him a strength that no one could successfully resist. Hildebrand, revived, could have rejoiced over this apparent triumph of the Church over the state. So empowered, the clergy first regulated religious worship. "The whole household shall attend the sermons on Sunday, except when someone shall be left at home to tend the children or the cattle. If there is preaching on weekdays, all who can must come." Calvin preached 3 or 4 times a week. "Should anyone come after the sermon has begun, let him be warned. If he does not amend, let him pay a fine of 3 sous. No one was to be excused from Protestant services on the plea of having a different or private religious creed. Calvin was as thorough as any pope in rejecting individualism of belief. This greatest legislator of Protestantism completely repudiated that principle of private judgment with which the new religion had begun. He had seen the fragmentation of the Reformation into 100 sects, and foresaw more. In Geneva, he would have none of them. There, a body of learned divines would formulate an authoritative creed. Those Genevans who could not accept it would have to seek other habitats. Persistent absence from Protestant services or continued refusal to take the Eucharist was a punishable offense. Heresy again became an insult to God and treason to the state, and was to be punished with death. Catholicism, which had preached this view of heresy, became heresy in its turn. Between 1542 and 1564, 58 persons were put to death, and 76 were banished for violating the new code. Here, as elsewhere, witchcraft was a capital crime. In 1 year, on the advice of the consistory, 14 alleged witches were sent to the stake on the charge that they had persuaded Satan to afflict Geneva with plague. The consistory made little distinction between religion and morality. Conduct was to be guided as carefully as belief, for good conduct was the goal of right belief. Calvin himself, austere and severe, dreamed of a community so well regulated that its virtue would prove his theology and would shame the Catholicism that had produced or tolerated the luxury and laxity of Rome. Discipline should be the backbone of personality, enabling it to rise out of the baseness of human nature to the erect stature of the self-conquered man. The clergy must lead by example as well as precept. They may marry and beget, but they must abstain from hunting, gambling, feasting, commerce, and secular amusements, and accept annual visitation and moral scrutiny by their ecclesiastical superiors. To regulate lay conduct, a system of domiciliary visits was established. One or another of the elders visited yearly each house in the quarter assigned to him, and questioned the occupants on all phases of their lives. Consistory and council joined in the prohibition of gambling, card-playing, profanity, drunkenness, the frequenting of taverns, dancing, which was then enhanced by kisses and embraces, indecent or irreligious songs, excess in entertainment, extravagance in living, immodesty in dress. The allowable color and quantity of clothing and the number of dishes permissible at a meal were specified by law. Jewelry and lace were frowned upon. A woman was jailed for arranging her hair to an immoral height. Theatrical performances were limited to religious plays, and then these too were forbidden. Children were to be named not after saints in the Catholic calendar, but preferably after Old Testament characters. An obstinate father served 4 days in prison for insisting on naming his son Claude instead of Abraham. Censorship of the press was taken over from Catholic and secular precedents and enlarged, this in 1560. Books of erroneous religious doctrine or of immoral tendency were banned. Montaigne's Essays and Rousseau's Emile were later to fall under this prescription. To speak disrespectfully of Calvin or the clergy was a crime. A first violation of these ordinances was punished with a reprimand, further violation with fines, persistent violation with imprisonment or banishment. Fornication was to be punished with exile or drowning, adultery, blasphemy, or idolatry with death. In one extraordinary instance, a child was beheaded for striking its parents. In the years 1558 to 59, there were 414 prosecutions for moral offenses. Between 1542 and 1564, there were 76 banishments and 58 executions. The total population of Geneva was then about 20,000. As everywhere in the 16th century, torture was often used to obtain confessions or evidence. Regulation was extended to education, society, and the economic life. Calvin established schools and an academy, searched through Western Europe for good teachers of Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and theology, and trained young ministers who carried his gospel into France, Holland, Scotland, and England with all the ardor and devotion of Jesuit missionaries in Asia. In 11 years, from 1555 to 1566, Geneva sent 161 such envoys into France, many of whom sang Huguenot psalms as they suffered martyrdom. Calvin considered class divisions natural, and his legislation protected rank and dignity by prescribing the quality of dress and the limits of activity for each class. Every person was expected to accept his place in society and to perform its duties without envy of his betters or complaint of his lot. Begging was banned, and indiscriminate charity was replaced by careful communal administration of poor relief. Calvinism gave to hard work, sobriety, diligence, frugality, and thrift a religious sanction and laurel that may have shared in developing the industrious temper of the modern Protestant businessman. But this relationship has been overstressed. Capitalism was more highly developed in Catholic Florence and Flanders before the Reformation than in Calvin's Geneva. Calvin rejected individualism in economics as well as in religion and morals. The unity of society, in his view, was not the free individual, with whom Luther had begun his revolt, but the city-state community whose members were bound to it in rigorous law and discipline. No member of the Christian community, he wrote, holds his gifts to himself or for his private use, but shares them among his fellow members, nor does he derive benefit save from those things which proceed from the common profit of the body as a whole. He had no sympathy with acquisitive speculation or ruthless accumulation. Like some late medieval Catholic theorists, he permitted interest on loans, but in theory he limited it to 5% and urged loans without interest to necessitous individuals or the state. With his approval, the consistory punished engrossers, monopolists, and lenders who charged excessive interest. It fixed prices for food and clothes and surgical operations. It censured or fined merchants who defrauded their clients, dealers who skimped their measures, clothiers who cut their cloth too short. Sometimes the regime moved toward state socialism. The venerable company established a bank and conducted some industries. If we bear these limiting factors in mind, we may admit a quiet and growing entente between Calvinism and business. Calvin could not long have kept his leadership had he obstructed the commercial development of a city whose commerce was its life. He adjusted himself to the situation, allowed interest charges of 10%, and recommended state loans to finance the introduction or expansion of private industry, as in the manufacture of clothing or the production of silk. Commercial centers like Antwerp, Amsterdam, and London took readily to the first modern religion that accepted the modern economy. Calvinism took the middle classes into its fold and grew with their growth. What were the results of Calvin's rule? The difficulties of enforcement must have been extreme, for never in history had such strict virtue been required of a city. A considerable party opposed the regimen, even to the point of open revolt, but a substantial number of influential citizens must have supported it, if only on the general theory of morals, that others need them. The influx of French Huguenots and other Protestants must have strengthened Calvin's hand, and the limitation of the experiment to Geneva and its hinterland raised the chances of success. The recurrent fear of invasion and absorption by hostile states, Savoy, Italy, France, the Empire, compelled political stability and civic obedience. External danger promoted internal discipline. In any case, we have an enthusiastic description of the results from the pen of an eyewitness, Bernardino Occhino, an Italian Protestant who had found refuge in Geneva. Cursing and swearing, unchastity, sacrilege, adultery, and impure living, such as prevail in many places where I have lived, are here unknown. There are no pimps and harlots. The people do not know what rouge is, and they are all clad in seemly fashion. Games of chance are not customary. Benevolence is so great that the poor need not beg. The people admonish one another in brotherly fashion, as Christ prescribes. Lawsuits are banished from the city, nor is there any simony, murder, or party spirit, but only peace and charity. On the other hand, there are no organs here, no voice of bells, no showy songs, no burning candles or lamps in the churches, no relics, pictures, statues, canopies, or splendid robes, no farces or cold ceremonies. The churches are quite free from idolatry. The extant records of the council for this period do not quite agree with this report. They reveal a high percentage of illegitimate children, abandoned infants, forced marriages, and sentences of death. Calvin's son-in-law and his stepdaughter were among those condemned for adultery. But then again, as late as 1610, we find Valentin Andrei, a Lutheran minister from Württemberg, praising Geneva enviously. When I was in Geneva, I observed something great, which I shall remember and desire as long as I live. There is in that city not only the perfect institute of a perfect republic, but, as a special ornament, a moral discipline which makes weekly investigations into the conduct and even the smallest transgressions of the citizens. All cursing and swearing, gambling, luxury, strife, hatred, fraud, etc., are forbidden, while greater sins are hardly heard of. What a glorious ornament of the Christian religion is such a purity of morals! We must lament with tears that it is wanting with us Germans, and almost totally neglected. If it were not for the difference of religion, I would have been chained to Geneva forever. 5. The conflicts of Calvin. Calvin's character harmonized with his theology. The oil painting in the University Library at Geneva pictures him as a severe and somber mystic, dark but bloodless complexion, scanty black beard, high forehead, penetrating, ruthless eyes. He was short and thin and physically frail, hardly fit to carry a city in his hands, But behind the weak frame burned a mind sharp, narrow, devoted, and intense, and a firm, indomitable will, perhaps a will to power. His intellect was a citadel of order, making him almost the Aquinas of Protestant theology. His memory was crowded and yet precise. He was ahead of his time in doubting astrology, abreast of it in rejecting Copernicus, a bit behind it, like Luther, in ascribing many terrestrial occurrences to the devil. His timidity concealed his courage, his shyness disguised an inner pride, his humility before God became at times a commanding arrogance before men. He was painfully sensitive to criticism and could not bear opposition with the patience of one who can conceive the possibility that he may be wrong. Racked with illness, bent with work, he often lost his temper and broke out into fits of angry eloquence. He confessed to Butzer that he found it difficult to tame the wild beast of his wrath. His virtues did not include humor, which might have softened his certainties, nor a sense of beauty, which might have spared ecclesiastical art. Yet he was no unmitigated killjoy. He bade his followers be cheerful, play harmless games like bowling or quoits, and enjoy wine in moderation. He could be a kind and tender friend, and an unforgiving enemy, capable of hard judgments and stern revenge. Those who served him feared him, but those loved him most who knew him best. Sexually, his life showed no fault. He lived simply, ate sparingly, fasted unostentatiously, slept only 6 hours a day, never took a holiday, used himself up without stint in what he thought was the service of God. He refused increases in salary, but labored to raise funds for the relief of the poor. The strength of that heretic, said Pope Pius IV, consisted in this, that money never had the slightest charm for him. If I had such servants, my dominion would extend from sea to sea. A man of such mettle must raise many enemies. He fought them with vigor and in the controversial language of the time. He described his opponents as riffraff, idiots, dogs, asses, pigs, and stinking beasts, epithets less becoming to his elegant Latinity than to Luther's gladiatorial style. But he had provocations. One day, Jérôme Bossuet, an ex-monk from France, interrupted Calvin's sermon at St. Peter's to denounce the predestinarian doctrine as an insult to God. Calvin answered him by citing Scripture. The police arrested Bossuet. The consistory charged him with heresy. The council was inclined to put him to death. But when the opinions of theologians in Zurich, Basel, and Bern were solicited, they proved disconcerting. Bern recommended caution in dealing with problems beyond human ken, a new note in the literature of the age. And Bullinger warned Calvin that many are displeased with what you say in your institutes about predestination, and draw the same conclusions as Bossuet. The council compromised on banishment in 1551. Bossuet returned to France and Catholicism. More important in result was Calvin's controversy with Joachim Westphal. This Lutheran minister of Hamburg denounced as satanic blasphemies the view of Zwingli and Calvin that Christ was only spiritually present in the Eucharist, and thought the Swiss reformers should be refuted not by the pens of theologians, but by the rods of magistrates. This in 1552. Calvin answered him in terms so severe that his fellow reformers at Zurich, Basel, and Bern refused to sign his remonstrance. He issued it nevertheless. Westphal and other Lutherans returned to the attack. Calvin branded them as apes of Luther, and argued so effectively that several regions hitherto Lutheran, Brandenburg, the Palatinate, and parts of Hesse, Bremen, Anhalt, and Baden, were won to the Swiss view and the Reformed Church. Only the silence of Melanchthon, who secretly agreed with Calvin, and the post-mortem echo of Luther's thunderbolts saved the rest of northern Germany for the Lutheran creed. Turning from these assaults on the right, Calvin faced on the left a group of radicals recently arrived in Switzerland from Counter-Reformation Italy. Caelius Secundus Curio, teaching in Lausanne and Basel, shocked Calvin by announcing that the saved, including many heathen, would far outnumber the damned. Lilius Socinus, son of a leading Italian jurist, settled in Zurich, studied Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew in order to understand the Bible better, learned too much, and lost his faith in the Trinity, predestination, original sin, and the atonement. He expressed his skepticism to Calvin, who answered as well as possible. Socinus agreed to refrain from public utterance of his doubts, but later he spoke out against the execution of Servetus, and was among the few who, in that fevered age, stood up for religious toleration. In a state where religion and government were fused in an intoxicating mixture, it was natural that Calvin's most persistent conflicts should be with the Patriotes and Libertins, who had once expelled him and now deplored his return. The Patriots resented his French origin and supporters, abhorred his theology, nicknamed him Cain, and called their dogs Calvin. They insulted him in the streets, and probably it was they who one night fired 50 shots outside his home. The Libertins preached a pantheistic creed without devils, angels, Eden, atonement, Bible, or Pope. Queen Margaret of Navarre received and supported them at her court in Iraq, and reproved Calvin for his severity with them. On June 27, 1547, Calvin found attached to his pulpit a placard reading, "Gross hypocrite, you and your companions will gain little by your pains. If you do not save yourselves by flight, nobody shall prevent your overthrow, and you will curse the hour when you left your monkery. After people have suffered long, they avenge themselves. Take care that you are not served like Monsieur Verle, who had been killed. We will not have so many masters." Jacques Rouet, a leading libertin, was arrested on suspicion of having written the placard. No proof was adduced. It was claimed that he had some days previously uttered threats against Calvin. In his room were found papers, allegedly in his handwriting, calling Calvin a haughty and ambitious hypocrite, and ridiculing the inspiration of the Scriptures and the immortality of the soul. He was tortured twice daily for 30 days until he confessed, we do not know how truthfully, that he had affixed the placard and conspired with French agents against Calvin in Geneva. On July 26th, half dead, he was tied to a stake, his feet were nailed to it, and his head was cut off. Tension mounted until, on December 16, 1547, the Patriotes and Libertins came armed to a meeting of the Great Council and demanded an end to the power of the consistory over the citizens. At the height of a violent tumult, Calvin entered the room, faced the hostile leaders, and said, striking his breast, "If you want blood, there are still a few drops here. Strike then." Swords were drawn, but no one ventured to be the first assassin. Calvin addressed the gathering with rare moderation and finally persuaded all parties to a truce. Nevertheless, his confidence in himself was shaken. On December 17th, he wrote to Viret, "I hardly hope that the Church can be upheld much longer, at least by my ministry. Believe me, my power is broken, unless God stretch forth his hand." But the opposition divided into factions and subsided till the trial of Servetus offered another opportunity. 6. Michael Servetus, 1511 to 1553. Miguel Serveto was born at Villanova, some 60 miles north of Saragossa, son of a notary of good family. He grew up at a time when the writings of Erasmus were enjoying a transitory tolerance in Spain. He was in some measure influenced by the literature of the Jews and the Moslems. He read the Koran, made his way through rabbinical commentaries, and was impressed by the Semitic criticism of Christianity, with its prayers to a Trinity, to Mary, and to saints, as polytheistic. Luther called him the Moor. At Toulouse, where he studied law, he saw for the first time a complete Bible, vowed to read it 1,000 times, and was deeply moved by the visions of the Apocalypse. He won the patronage of Juan de Quintana, confessor to Charles V, and was taken by Juan to Bologna and Augsburg in 1530. Michael discovered Protestantism and liked it. He visited Ecolampadius at Basel and Capito and Butzer at Strasbourg. Soon he was too heretical for their taste and was invited to graze in other fields. In 1531 and 1532 he published the first and second edition of his basic work, De Trinitatis Erroribus. It was rather confused, and in a crude Latin that must have made Calvin smile, if ever. But in wealth of biblical erudition it was an astonishing performance for a lad of 20. Jesus, in Servetus's view, was a man into whom God the Father had breathed the Logos, the divine wisdom. In this sense, Jesus became the Son of God. But he was not equal or co-eternal with the Father, who might communicate the same spirit of wisdom to other men. The Son was sent from the Father in no other way than as one of the prophets. This was pretty close to Muhammad's conception of Christ. Servetus proceeded to take the Semitic view of Trinitarianism. All those who believe in a Trinity in the essence of God are tritheists, and he added they are true atheists as deniers of the one God. This was youthfully extreme, but Servetus tried to soften his heresy by inditing rhapsodies on Christ as the light of the world. Most of his readers, however, felt that he had extinguished the light. As if to leave no stone unhurled, he concurred with the Anabaptists that baptism should be given only to adults. Ecolampadius and Butzer repudiated him, and Servetus, reversing Calvin's itinerary, fled from Switzerland to France in 1532. On July 17th, the Inquisition at Toulouse issued a warrant for his arrest. He thought of going to America, but found Paris more agreeable. There, disguising himself as Michel de Villeneuve, the family name, he studied mathematics, geography, astronomy, and medicine, and flirted with astrology. The great Vesalius was his fellow student in dissection, and their teachers praised them equally. He quarreled with the dean of the medical faculty, and seems in general to have given offense by his impetuosity, passion, and pride. He challenged Calvin to a debate, but did not appear at the appointed place and time, this in 1534. In the furor over Cope's address and the heretical placards, Servetus, like Calvin, left Paris. At Lyons he edited a scholarly edition of Ptolemy's Geography. In 1540 he moved to Vienne, 16 miles south of Lyons, and there he lived till his last year, practicing medicine and scholarship. Out of so many scholars available to the Lyons publishers' printers, he was chosen to edit a Latin translation of the Bible by Sante Spagnini. The work took him 3 years and ran to 6 volumes. In a note on Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, which Jerome had rendered, "A virgin shall conceive," Servetus explained that the Hebrew word meant not virgin, but young woman, and he suggested that it referred not prophetically to Mary, but simply to Hezekiah's wife. In the same spirit, he indicated that other seemingly prophetic passages in the Old Testament referred only to contemporary figures or events. This proved disconcerting to Protestants and Catholics alike. We do not know when Servetus discovered the pulmonary circulation of the blood, the passage of the blood from the right chamber of the heart along the pulmonary artery to and through the lungs, its purification there by aeration, and its return via the pulmonary vein to the left chamber of the heart. So far as is now known, he did not publish his finding till 1553, when he included it in his final work, The Restitution of Christianity. He brought the theory into a theological treatise because he thought of the blood as the vital spirit in man, and therefore, more probably than the heart or the brain, the real seat of the soul. Deferring for a while the problem of Servetus's priority in this discovery, we merely note that he had apparently completed the Christianismi Restitutio by 1546, for in that year he sent the manuscript to Calvin. The very title was a challenge to the man who had written the Christianae Religionis Institutio. But further, the book sharply rejected as blasphemy the notion that God had predestined souls to hell regardless of their merits or guilt. God, said Servetus, condemns no one who does not condemn himself. Faith is good, but love is better, and God himself is love. Calvin thought it sufficient refutation of all this to send Servetus a copy of the Institutes. Servetus returned it with insulting annotations, and followed up with a series of letters so contemptuous that Calvin wrote to Farel, on February 13, 1546, "Servetus has just sent me a long volume of his ravings. If I consent, he will come here, but I will not give my word. For should he come, if my authority is of any avail, I will not suffer him to get out alive." Servetus, angry at Calvin's refusal to continue the correspondence, wrote to Abel Pupin, one of the Genevese ministers, in 1547. "Your gospel is without God, without true faith, without good works. Instead of a God, you have a three-headed Cerberus, the predestinating Trinity. For faith, you have a deterministic dream. Man is with you an inert trunk, and God is a chimera of the enslaved will. You close the kingdom of heaven before men. Woe, woe, woe! This is the 3rd letter I have written to warn you, that you may know better. I will not warn you again. In this fight of Michael I know that I shall certainly die, but I do not falter. Christ will come. He will not tarry." Obviously, Servetus was a bit more insane than the average of his time. He announced that the end of the world was at hand, that the Archangel Michael would lead a holy war against both the papal and the Genevese antichrists, and that he, who had been named after the Archangel, would fight and die in that war. The Restitutio was a call to that war. No wonder it had difficulty finding a publisher. The Basel printers shied away from it. Finally, on January 3, 1553, it was clandestinely printed in Vienne by Balthazar Annouillet and Guillaume Guéraud. Their names and the place of publication were omitted, and the author signed himself only as MSV. He paid all the expenses, corrected the proofs, and then destroyed the manuscript. The volume ran to 734 pages, for it included a revised form of De Trinitatis Erroribus and Servetus's 30 letters to Calvin. Of the 1,000 copies printed, some were sent to a bookseller in Geneva. There one came into the hands of Guillaume Tree, a friend of Calvin's. The 30 letters made plain to Calvin that MSV stood for Michael Servetus of Villanova. On February 26, 1553, Tree wrote to a Catholic cousin in Lyon, Antoine Arnay, expressing surprise that Cardinal François de Tournon should allow such a book to be printed in his diocese. How did Tree know the place of publication? Calvin knew that Servetus was living in Lyon or Vienne. Arnay brought the matter to Matthias Horry, inquisitor at Lyon. Horry notified the cardinal, who ordered Maugiron, lieutenant governor of Vienne, to investigate. On March 16th, Servetus was summoned to Maugiron's house. Before obeying, he destroyed all papers that might incriminate him. He denied having written the book. Arnay dispatched to Tree a request for more evidence of Servetus's authorship. Tree obtained from Calvin some of Servetus's letters and sent them to Lyon. They tallied with several letters in the book. On April 4th, Servetus was arrested. 3 days later, he escaped by leaping over a garden wall. On June 17th, the civil court of Vienne condemned him, if found, to be burned alive by a slow fire. Servetus wandered about France for 3 months. He decided to seek refuge in Naples and to go via Geneva. For reasons unknown, he remained in Geneva a month under an assumed name, and meanwhile he arranged for transportation to Zurich. On Sunday, August 13th, he attended church, perhaps to avoid investigation by the authorities. He was recognized. Calvin was informed and ordered his arrest. Calvin explained this action in a later letter of September 9, 1553. When the papists are so harsh and violent in defense of their superstitions that they rage cruelly to shed innocent blood, are not Christian magistrates shamed to show themselves less ardent in defense of the sure truth? The small council followed Calvin's lead and outran his ferocity. Since Servetus was only a transient and not a citizen subject to the laws of Geneva, the council could not legally do more than banish him. He was confined in the former episcopal palace, now a prison. He was not tortured, except by the lice that infested his cell. He was allowed paper and ink and whatever books he cared to buy, and Calvin lent him several volumes of the early fathers. The trial was carefully conducted, lasting over 2 months. The indictment was drawn up by Calvin in 38 articles, supported by quotations from the writings of Servetus. One charge was that he had accepted Strabo's description of Judea as a barren country, whereas the Bible called it a land flowing with milk and honey. The basic accusations were that Servetus had rejected the Trinity and infant baptism. He was also accused of having, in the person of Monsieur Calvin, defamed the doctrines of the Gospel of the Church of Geneva. On August 17th and 21st, Calvin appeared in person as the accuser. Servetus defended his views boldly, even to pantheism. By an unusual cooperation of hostile faiths, the Protestant Council of Geneva asked the Catholic judges at Vienne for particulars of the charges that had been brought against Servetus there. One new count was sexual immorality. Servetus replied that rupture had long since made him impotent and had kept him from marriage. He was further accused of having attended Mass at Vienne. He pleaded fear of death as exculpation. He challenged the jurisdiction of a civil court over cases of heresy. He assured the court that he had engaged in no sedition and had not violated the laws of Geneva, and he asked for an attorney, better acquainted than himself with these laws, to help him in his defense. These pleas were refused. The French Inquisition sent an agent to Geneva to demand that Servetus be sent back to France for the execution of the sentence that had been pronounced against him. Servetus, in tears, begged the council to reject this demand. It did, but the demand may have stimulated the council to equal the Inquisition in severity. On September 1st, 2 enemies of Calvin, Ami Perrin and Philibert Berthier, were allowed to join the judges in the trial. They engaged Calvin in disputes to no result, but they persuaded the council to consult the other churches of Protestant Switzerland on how Servetus should be treated. On September 2nd, Calvin's leadership in the city was again challenged in the council by Patriotes and Libertins. He survived the storm, but the evident desire of the opposition to rescue Servetus may have hardened Calvin to pursue the heretic to the death. However, we should note that the chief prosecutor in the trial was Claude Rigaud, a Libertin. On September 3rd, Servetus presented to the council a written reply to the 38 charges adduced by Calvin. He met each point with keen argument and scriptural or patristic citations. He questioned Calvin's right to interfere in the trial and called him a disciple of Simon Magus, a criminal and a homicide. Calvin answered in 23 pages. These were submitted to Servetus, who returned them to the council with such marginal comments as liar, impostor, hypocrite, miserable wretch. Probably the strain of a month's imprisonment and mental torment had broken Servetus's self-control. Calvin's reports of the trial are themselves in the manner of the time. He writes of Servetus that the dirty dog wiped his snout, the perfidious scamp soils each page with impious ravings. Servetus petitioned the council to indict Calvin as a represser of the truth of Jesus Christ, to exterminate him, confiscate his goods, and with the proceeds reimburse Servetus for the losses he had sustained by Calvin's actions. The suggestion was not favorably received. On October 18th, the replies came in from the Swiss churches, whose council had been asked. All advised the condemnation of Servetus, none his execution. On October 25th, Perrin made a last effort to save him by moving for a retrial before the Council of 200. He was overruled. On the 26th, the small council, with no member dissenting, passed sentence of death on 2 counts of heresy, Unitarianism and the rejection of infant baptism. When Servetus heard the sentence, says Calvin, he moaned like a madman and beat his breast and bellowed in Spanish, "Misericordia! Misericordia!" He asked to talk with Calvin. He pleaded with him for mercy. Calvin offered no more than to give him the final consolations of the true religion if he would retract his heresies. Servetus would not. He asked to be beheaded rather than burned. Calvin was inclined to support this plea, but the aged Farel, in at the death, reproved him for such tolerance, and the council voted that Servetus should be burned alive. The sentence was carried out the next morning, October 27, 1553, on the hill of Champel, just south of Geneva. On the way, Farel importuned Servetus to earn divine mercy by confessing the crime of heresy. According to Farel, the condemned man replied, "I am not guilty, I have not merited death," and he besought God to pardon his accusers. He was fastened to a stake by iron chains, and his last book was bound to his side. When the flames reached his face, he shrieked with agony. After half an hour of burning, he died. 7. An appeal for toleration. Catholics and Protestants united in approving the sentence. The Inquisition at Vienne, cheated of its living prey, burned Servetus in effigy. Melanchthon, in a letter to Calvin and Bullinger, gave thanks to the Son of God for the punishment of this blasphemous man, and called the burning a pious and memorable example to all posterity. Butzer declared from his pulpit in Strasbourg that Servetus had deserved to be disemboweled and torn to pieces. Bullinger, generally humane, agreed that civil magistrates must punish blasphemy with death. Yet even in Calvin's day some voices spoke for Servetus. A Sicilian wrote a long poem, De Injusto Serveti Incendio. David Joris of Basel, an Anabaptist, published a protest against the execution, but under a pseudonym. After his death, his authorship was discovered. His body was exhumed and publicly burned in 1566. The political opponents of Calvin naturally condemned his treatment of Servetus, and some of his friends deprecated the severity of the sentence as encouraging the Catholics of France to apply the death penalty to Huguenots. Such criticism must have been widespread, for in February 1554, Calvin issued a Defensio Orthodoxae Fidei de Sacra Trinitate contra prodigiosos errores Michaelis Serveti. If, he argued, we believe in the inspiration of the Bible, then we know the truth, and all who oppose it are enemies and blasphemers of God. Since their offense is immeasurably greater than any other crime, the civil authority must punish heretics as worse than murderers, for murder merely kills the body, while heresy, accepted, damns the soul to everlasting hell. This was precisely the Catholic position. Moreover, God himself has explicitly instructed us to kill heretics, to smite with the sword any city that abandons the worship of the true faith revealed by him. Calvin quoted the ferocious decrees of Deuteronomy, chapter 13, verses 5 through 15, chapter 17, verses 2 through 5, Exodus, chapter 22, verse 20, and Leviticus, chapter 24, verse 16, and argued from them with truly burning eloquence, "Whoever shall maintain that wrong is done to heretics and blasphemers in punishing them makes himself an accomplice in their crime. There is no question here of man's authority. It is God who speaks, and it is clear what law he would have kept in the Church even to the end of the world. Wherefore does he demand of us so extreme severity, if not to show us that due honor is not paid him so long as we set not his service above every human consideration, so that we spare not kin nor blood of any, and forget all humanity when the matter is to combat for his glory?" Calvin moderated his conclusions by counseling mercy to those whose heresies were not fundamental or were clearly due to ignorance or feebleness of mind. But whereas in general he accepted St. Paul as his guide, he refused to use the Pauline expedient of declaring the old law superseded by the new. In truth, the theocracy that he had apparently established would have crumbled into disorder if differences of creed had been allowed public voice. What, meanwhile, had become of the Erasmian spirit of tolerance? Erasmus had been tolerant because he had not been certain. Luther and Melanchthon had abandoned tolerance as they progressed in certainty. Calvin, with lethal precocity, had been certain almost from his 20th year. A few humanists who had studied classic thought and had not been frightened back into the Roman fold by distaste for the violence of theological strife remained to suggest diffidently that certainty in religion and philosophy is unattainable and that therefore theologians and philosophers should not kill. The humanist who spoke most clearly for tolerance amid the clash of certainties had been for a time one of Calvin's closest friends. Sebastian Castellio, born in the French Jura in 1515, became an adept in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, taught Greek at Lyon, lived with Calvin in Strasbourg, was appointed by him rector of the Latin school at Geneva in 1541, and began there a translation of the entire Bible into Ciceronian Latin. While he admired Calvin as a man, he abominated the doctrine of predestination and fretted under the new discipline of body and mind. In 1544 he charged the Genevese ministers with intolerance, impurity, and drunkenness. Calvin complained to the council. Castellio was found guilty of calumny and was banished in 1544. For 9 years he lived in great poverty, supporting a large family, and working at night on his version of the Scriptures. He finished this in 1551. Then, lonesome for the placid drudgery of scholarship, he began again at Genesis, chapter 1, verse 1, and translated the Bible into French. Finally, in 1553, he obtained a professorship of Greek at the University of Basel. He sympathized with the Unitarians, longed to help Servetus, and was shocked by Calvin's defense of the execution. Under assumed names, he and Caelius Curio published in March 1554 the first modern classic on toleration, De Haereticis Unsint Persequendi, Should Heretics Be Persecuted? The main body of the work was an anthology, compiled by Curio, of Christian pleas for tolerance, from Lactantius and Jerome to Erasmus, the early Luther, and Calvin himself. Castellio contributed the argument in preface and epilogue. For hundreds of years, he pointed out, men had debated free will, predestination, heaven and hell, Christ and the Trinity, and other difficult matters. No agreement had been reached, probably none would ever be reached. But none is necessary, said Castellio. Such disputes do not make men better. All that we need is to carry the Spirit of Christ into our daily lives, to feed the poor, help the sick, and love even our enemies. It seemed to him ridiculous that all the new sects, as well as the old church, should pretend to absolute truth and make their creeds obligatory on those over whom they had physical power. As a result, a man would be orthodox in one city and become a heretic by entering another. He would have to change his religion, like his money, at each frontier. Can we imagine Christ ordering a man to be burned alive for advocating adult baptism? The Mosaic laws calling for the death of a heretic were superseded by the law of Christ, which is one of mercy, not of despotism and terror. If a man denies life after death and rejects all law, he may, said Castellio, be justly silenced by the magistrates, but he should not be killed. Moreover, he thought, persecution of beliefs is futile. Martyrdom for an idea spreads the idea far more rapidly than the martyr could have done had he been allowed to live. What a tragedy, he concluded, that those who had so lately freed themselves from the terrible Inquisition should so soon imitate its tyranny, should so soon force men back into Cimmerian darkness after so promising a dawn. Knowing Castellio's sentiments, Calvin at once recognized his hand in the De Haereticis. He delegated the task of answering it to his most brilliant disciple, Théodore de Bèche, or Bez or Beza. Born in Vézelay, of aristocratic lineage, Théodore studied law at Orléans and Bourges, practiced it successfully in Paris, wrote Latin poetry, charmed some women by his wit, or by his prosperity, lived a gay life, married, fell dangerously ill, experienced a sickbed conversion reverse to Loyola's, adopted Protestantism, fled to Geneva, presented himself to Calvin, and was made professor of Greek at the University of Lausanne. It is remarkable that a Protestant refugee from a Huguenot persecuting France should have undertaken to defend persecution. He did it with the skill of a lawyer and the devotion of a friend. In September 1554, he issued his little book on the duty of civil magistrates to punish heretics. He pointed out again that religious toleration was impossible to one who accepted the divine inspiration of the Scriptures. But if we reject the Bible as God's word, on what shall we build the religious faith that is so clearly indispensable, considering the natural wickedness of men, to moral restraint, social order, and civilization? Nothing would then be left but chaotic doubts disintegrating Christianity. To a sincere believer in the Bible, there could be only one religion. All others must be false or incomplete. Yes, the New Testament preaches a law of love, but this does not excuse us from punishing thieves and murderers. How then does it warrant us in sparing heretics? Castellio returned to the contest in a tract Contra Libellum Calvini, but it lay unpublished for half a century. In another manuscript, De Arte Dubitandi, he anticipated Descartes by making the art of doubting the first step in the pursuit of truth. In Four Dialogues of 1578, he defended free will and the possibility of universal salvation. In 1562, in Conseil à la France désolée, he appealed in vain to Catholics and Protestants to end the civil wars that were devastating France, and to allow every believer in Christ to serve God according not to other men's faith, but to his own. Hardly anyone heard a voice so out of tune with the time. Castellio died in poverty at the age of 48 in 1563. Calvin pronounced his early death a just judgment of a just God. 8. Calvin to the end, 1554 to 1564. Perhaps Calvin knew Castellio's secret leaning toward Unitarianism, belief in a God not triune, therefore a rejection of Christ's divinity, and he can be forgiven for seeing in this basic doubt the beginning of the end for Christianity. He feared this heresy all the more because he found it in Geneva itself, above all among the Protestant fugitives from Italy. These men saw no sense in replacing incredible transubstantiation with incredible predestination. Their rebellion attacked the fundamental assumption of Christianity, that Christ was the Son of God. Matteo Gribaldi, professor of jurisprudence at Padua, had a summer home near Geneva. During the trial of Servetus, he spoke openly against civil punishment for religious opinions and advocated freedom of worship for all. Hailed before the council, he was banished on suspicion of Unitarianism in 1559. He secured appointment as professor of law in the University of Tübingen. Calvin sent word there of Gribaldi's doubts. The university pressed him to sign a Trinitarian confession. Instead, he fled to Bern, where he died of the plague in 1564. Giorgio Blandrada, an Italian physician domiciled in Geneva, was summoned before the council on a charge of questioning the divinity of Christ. He fled to Poland, where he found some tolerance for his heresy. Valentino Gentile, from Calabria, openly expressed Unitarian views in Geneva, was thrown into prison, was sentenced to death in 1557, recanted, was released, went to Lyon, was arrested by the Catholic authorities, but was freed on his assurance that his chief interest lay in refuting Calvin. He joined Blandrata in Poland, returned to Switzerland, was seized by the Bernese magistrates, was convicted of perjury and heresy, and was beheaded in 1566. Amid these battles for the Lord, Calvin continued to live simply and to rule Geneva by the power of a personality armed with the delusions of his followers. His position became stronger as years gave it roots. His only weakness was physical. Headaches, asthma, dyspepsia, stone, gout, and fever racked and thinned his frame and formed his face to taut severity and gloom. A long illness in 1558 to 59 left him lame and feeble, with repeated hemorrhages of the lungs. Thereafter he had to keep to his bed most of the time, though he continued to study, direct, and preach, even when he had to be borne to the sanctuary in a chair. On April 25, 1564, he made his will, full of confidence in his election to everlasting glory. On the 26th, the syndics and the council came to his bedside. He asked their pardon for his outbreaks of anger, and begged them to hold steadfastly to the pure doctrine of the Reformed Church. Farel, now in his 80th year, came from Neuchâtel to bid him au revoir. After many days of prayer and suffering, Calvin found peace on May 27, 1564. His influence was even greater than Luther's, but he walked in a path that Luther had cleared. Luther had protected his new church by rallying German nationalism to its support. The move was necessary, but it tied Lutheranism too narrowly to Teutonic stocks. Calvin loved France and labored to promote the Huguenot cause, but he was no nationalist. Religion was his country, and so his doctrine, however modified, inspired the Protestantism of Switzerland, France, Scotland, and America, and captured large sectors of Protestantism in Hungary, Poland, Germany, Holland, and England. Calvin gave to Protestantism in many lands an organization, confidence, and pride that enabled it to survive 1,000 trials. A year before his death, his pupil, Olivianus, joined with Melanchthon's pupil Ursinus in preparing the Heidelberg Catechism, which became the accepted expression of the Reformed faith in Germany and Holland. Bez and Bullinger reconciled the creeds of Calvin and Zwingli in the Second Helvetic Confession in 1566, which became authoritative for the Reformed churches in Switzerland and France. In Geneva itself, Calvin's work was ably continued by Bez. But year by year the business leaders who controlled the councils resisted more and more successfully the attempts of the consistory and the Venerable Company to place moral checks upon economic operations. After Bez's death in 1608, the merchant princes consolidated their supremacy, and the Genevan Church lost the directive privileges that Calvin had won for it in non-religious affairs. In the 18th century, the influence of Voltaire moderated the Calvinist tradition and ended the sway of a Puritan ethic among the people. Catholicism patiently struggled to recapture a place in the city. It offered a Christianity without gloom and an ethic without severity. In 1954, the population was 42% Catholic, 47% Protestant. But the most impressive man-made structure in Geneva is the noble Reformation Monument, which, running majestically along a park wall, celebrates the victories of Protestantism and raises at its center the powerful figures of Farel, Calvin, Bez, and Knox. Meanwhile, the hard theocracy of Calvin was sprouting democratic buds. The efforts of the Calvinist leaders to give schooling to all, and their inculcation of disciplined character, helped the sturdy burghers of Holland to oust the alien dictatorship of Spain, and supported the revolt of nobles and clergy in Scotland against a fascinating but imperious queen. The stoicism of a hard creed made the strong souls of the Scottish Covenanters, the English and Dutch Puritans, the Pilgrims of New England. It steadied the heart of Cromwell, guided the pen of blind Milton, and broke the power of the backward-facing Stuarts. It encouraged brave and ruthless men to win a continent and spread the base of education and self-government until all men could be free. Men who chose their own pastors soon claimed to choose their governors, and the self-ruled congregation became the self-governed municipality. The myth of divine election justified itself in the making of America. When this function had been performed, the theory of predestination fell into the backwaters of Protestant belief. As social order returned in Europe after the 30 Years' War, in England after the revolutions of 1642 and 1689, in America after 1793, the pride of divine election changed into the pride of work and accomplishment. Men felt stronger and more secure. Fear lessened, and the frightened cruelty that had generated Calvin's God gave way to a more humane vision that compelled a reconception of deity. Decade by decade, the churches that had taken their lead from Calvin discarded the harsher elements of his creed. Theologians dared to believe that all who died in infancy were saved, and one respected divine announced without causing a commotion that the number of the finally lost will be very inconsiderable. We are grateful to be so reassured, and we will agree that even error lives because it serves some vital need. But we shall always find it hard to love the man who darkened the human soul with the most absurd and blasphemous conception of God in all the long and honored history of nonsense.